everyone, welcome to TMC Online. We do have a last minute on-demand session that we're adding in. I've got Romesh Rodrigo here from Daimler. He's going to be delivering his presentation on electric trucks. And now while this is a pre-record session, please feel free to add your comments into the comment box because Romesh will be tuning in and answering those for you. And if you had anything else that you wanted to ask, feel free to ask it now. Now, thank you, Romesh, for joining us. I will hand over to you to kick off with your interesting presentation.
Okay, thank you, Emily, and welcome to my online recording of my truck session for the TMC for 2021 on electric vehicles, the future of urban freight. And I'd like to present it here from an OEM perspective. So I work for Daimler Truck and Bus Australia Pacific, and we of course represent the Freightliner, Mercedes-Benz and Mitsubishi Fuso truck and bus products within the Australian market. So one thing that's really important here is to have a good vision and strategic alignment all the way to the top for us as an OEM when we are looking to deliver these new technologies to the market. And we have this, and you can see here, this is a quote directly from Martin Daum, who is the chairman of the board of management for Daimler Truck globally. And you can see here that we are firmly on this path of commitment to go down to present CO2 neutral truck options to our customers into the future. And as we're talking about here, they're not just going to be battery and they're not just going to be hydrogen. In all reality, the freight task is going to require a very strategic solution here. And this is the way that we're approaching this task. Now, the Australian freight task, this is quite a formidable task in front of us. And those of you in the room are probably very familiar with this, that we have some pretty large challenges because of the size of our country and the demands that's placed onto the actual system of transport. And as we know it, and it was really highlighted during the COVID pandemic and during the recent lockdowns, and we're seeing it even today, that transportation is the indispensable backbone for our society and making it function. From delivering the goods to even some of the other things that we choose maybe not to think about, such as picking up the garbage. Now, as our urbanisation develops, there is just going to be such a greater demand put on this system, and we really need to be aware of this. And one of the things which I think is really key here is that we really need to consider the fact that trucks are tools of trade for our customers, and they are what our customers are purchasing these vehicles for so that they can run their businesses and generate an income. So that's something that we find really key. A truck is generally not something which is replaceable. If a truck breaks down, you just can't call an Uber truck to basically change the vehicle out. It's really critical that these vehicles, to the last point here, are reliable and efficient. Reliability is key because that's how our customers plan. And that's not just about the vehicles running consistently. We know that these mechanical devices do need attention and service. So it comes down to parts, training, and also the availability of a dealer network to support these vehicles in the market, whilst also running efficiently so that our customers are able to deliver to their customers and make a living and margin in the meantime as well. So going towards the topic of the presentation, the future is definitely electric. Now, part of what we are really looking at here is the fact that CO2 neutral is now where we're focusing. There's been a lot of discussion about cleanliness and so on, and this has really been centered around the local ADRs being ADR 80, and at the moment we're at ADR 8003, and we're all got our fingers crossed that at some point ADR 8004 will come into existence, which utilizes and accepts alternative standards, for example, Euro 6, which a lot of manufacturers are running on the road as we speak today. But make no mistake, the future for us is definitely going to be an electric drive, and it will be a combination of electric via battery and electric via hydrogen to suit the freight task that we've got at hand. Now, what's really critical to acknowledge here is that this change is already here. We're seeing it. Some of the OEMs in the country, being ourselves and even the Volvo Group, have introduced OEM-supported vehicles into the country. I must admit that our colleagues up north have done a very good job in introducing the silent beer delivery truck. So I think that's going to be quite engaging for us in terms of we look at the commodities that are being delivered. What's really important here is to acknowledge the fact that we are in Australia a technology taker market. We do take technology from the major manufacturing centres, being Europe, Japan and North America. And this is where we refer to the triad markets in this particular slide that are committing to net zero targets. So this is really critical for us because we're either going to be on the path where we can actually accept and get access to this technology, or we have to be very careful, and this is to the last point on this slide, that we don't get left behind because we're not keeping up and we're not being strategic for what we see as our future freight task. Now, it is really important also to acknowledge that commercial vehicle requirements are unique. Whilst there is some parallels to the passenger car network, in most of the time there is huge requirements from our perspective for commercial vehicles, whether it be the actual power required to recharge some of these large battery electric vehicles, or even simple things such as getting access to, say, a vehicle charger, which has an awning over it that can easily accommodate a car. However, a small light-duty truck, as pictured here in this slide of the Fuso e-Canter, would not be able to get near one of those charging points because of something like a canopy. But make no mistake, all of the OEMs, especially ourselves, we are focused on the zero emission future. And this is because this is what the future is. We want to survive. So what's the biggest challenge for us? It's storing and utilizing the energy. So we've already talked about the fact that the drive will be electric. And there's questions around battery or hydrogen. The reality is it will be both. So what we are envisaging in the medium to short term is that the last mile delivery, it would make sense for it to be battery electric vehicles. Some vehicles that can go back to depot and generally have an average distance traveled during the day, which is acceptable and workable for the current battery technology, which is available in the market. Now, of course, like anything, this technology will develop into the future. And we see that with things like our mobile phones that have shrunk over time as the technology has developed. Now, what's also really important for us here, though, is the recharging and refueling time. This is really critical. Now, if we currently look at how long it takes to recharge some of these electric vehicles, it's in the order of a couple of hours. We require a lot of energy to move the freight around the urban scenario. And then you start thinking about a line haul vehicle, which is something we also have to consider. That refueling and recharging time is very critical for us because think about the scheduling and the planning and so on to meet the demands that are out there. And also the fact that we can't afford to clog up some of these recharging and refueling centers as we do see today. Now, one of the big advantages and why there's a lot of focus on, say, hydrogen in this particular context is the fact that hydrogen is a way to make the fuel and the energy mobile for us. So one of the advantages of the hydrogen technology is, whilst it's still an electric vehicle, it actually enables us to transport this technology around the place, transport this energy around our network so that we can support our freight task. What is also really key for this CO2 neutral ambition that we are all signing up to is the fact that increased capacity and availability of renewable energy is a real key foundation for this whole net zero target that we're talking about. There has been a lot of discussion about, well, look, that's great. We can run an electric vehicle and we can recharge it, or even a hydrogen powered vehicle, which locally can have zero emission. However, if in terms of its total emission setup, if we are generating the power to charge these vehicles from non-environmentally friendly sources, we've really defeated the purpose of what we're trying to achieve. So it's really important that renewables are part of this consideration. And this is why so much of our discussion is not just about the truck or the vehicles themselves. It's about the policy and the infrastructure that has to go into place to support this change that we are seeing in the market, and also a change which is being pushed upon us for various reasons. So what about timing for transition? Now you can see here, this is pretty much a European-based slide in terms of what some of the key assumptions are here. However, it does have applicability to what we're looking at here. So at the moment, say we're talking about 2020, 2021, we're pretty much 100% internal combustion, the traditional vehicle diesel running that we're looking at. what we're actually looking to see into the future is by the end of the decade, around 2030, that we're going to have crossed this point where we're actually going to see a significant concentration of zero emission vehicles. So really, by the midpoint of this decade, 2024, 2025, and possibly 2026, we will see a higher concentration of hydrogen-powered vehicles potentially on the roads in trials, and we definitely will see many more series production battery electric vehicles on the road. In fact, Mercedes-Benz released their e-Actros into the European market about 2 weeks ago. So this is obviously part of the plan to go forwards to that point that we can see there as 2039, where we're almost looking at 100% zero emission vehicles. And we say, why 2039 instead of 2050? This actually takes into account the average age of vehicles, which in some of the triad markets, being North America, Japan, and Europe, and specifically North America, their average fleet age is about 10 years. So hence why we could probably only sell our last internal combustion vehicle as an OEM into these developed markets by 2039. So what's critical here? There has to be government support and policy to support this change. Zero emission powertrains will come down over time, but we do need to keep in mind, these are expensive powertrains. This is not an option for OEMs to sit there and think of how can we create more profit for ourselves. It's definitely not the case. These vehicles cost a lot to build. And what's really important to consider here is that the total cost of operation has to have some semblance to parity with our current technology. That's critical. And this is why I come back to the point. These are tools of trade. These are business tools. So they have to make sense. And we are very pragmatic when we come to considering that and with our planning as well. Now, there is also significant opportunity that presents with this change to electric vehicles. So if we look to the picture here, this is the Fuso e-Canter, which has been released into the market in February of this year. You'll start to see it permeating into some of the key fleets around the countries as they take up these vehicles on trial in their operations. One of the things that we saw during COVID, and this is a really good example, was the dropping of things like truck curfews because of the demand for freight. Now, what that brought with it was there had to be some sort of concession given for the noise that these vehicles generate whilst they're delivering out into the curfew hours. Think fast forward, or come to today. If you have an electric vehicle, this is a consideration which essentially goes away. These vehicles are quiet. So what I mean by increased utilization here is we could potentially run these fleets at a greater concentration during night or the off-peak period. And what that allows us to do is get those other gains that we're constantly talking about and our infrastructure providers, such as the road network, are looking at. We could actually run these vehicles more efficiently at night during off-peak times to get that effect of less traffic so that we actually get a better outcome for our customers and our operations. Now, driver training is also key. These vehicles, whilst they are a heavy vehicle, the way that they drive and operate is different. All you have to do is read many of the media reviews of these vehicles just to understand how their acceleration characteristics are, as well as how quiet they are, and also just that whole fact, they're really pleasant to drive as well. And this was what was really interesting in observing these vehicles being tested. Now, I talk about complementary technologies here. What the real important thing to consider here is that, again, we are trying to deliver a freight task. So complementary technologies will be potentially during the transition period. How do we utilize our existing internal combustion fleet whilst also considering the opportunities in the transition to the battery electric vehicle or the zero emission vehicles, which we're ultimately driving towards. This will force us to take into account at depots and scheduling and so on, and also on the road network, things like charging schedules. The challenge we have in Australia at the moment, and if I talk specifically for Victoria, we struggle to keep the air conditioning on during the summertime. That actually goes to the discussion that we have about the infrastructure and the power network to fuel this. And it goes back to the previous point we talked about in terms of renewables. There will be a greater demand for renewable energy, and specifically electrical power, to power these vehicles, to charge them, or potentially, when you see further down into the slide, support the production of hydrogen for some of these vehicles. And also refueling time. It's really important. We need to think about these vehicles. When they are sitting there not turning a wheel, they're not making money. So it is really critical that we think about how we schedule that into our planning, which then also comes into things like depot design. Do we have enough power going to these sites? Do we have more renewables on site? Do we look to generate more power on site? A lot of questions that really require further discussion and a plan to be put in place now to support this. And what's also really interesting and critical here is whilst the initial purchase price of a zero emission vehicle at the moment, and probably for the short term will be high, the actual cost per kilometre to operate these vehicles is considerably less. A lot of the initial analysis shows that these vehicles are probably better to operate in terms of a CPK calculation by about a third. So to reverse that, they're probably costing about 2/3 the price of their equivalent vehicle on a cost per kilometre basis. Now, this is of course very subjective and open to interpretation and how you apply this. But the reality is they do cost less to run by nature of the fact that they are, in theory, mechanically simpler to their internal combustion counterparts. Now, this is a really important one, and it really pertains to the discussion we're having today in this forum. The maintenance and serviceability of these vehicles is key. There is absolutely no point dropping in these high-tech zero-emission vehicles into our market if we cannot keep them on the road. And this is where all of the technicians, the dealers, the apprentices, and everything that supports those vehicles on the road is key. And this is where Daimler, as a global OEM and also a significant part of the Australian truck market, we take this very seriously. We do need to look at training our network and keeping them up to speed and supporting them and planning for that now, well before we introduce these vehicles, because we know that our customers expect that from us. As an industry, we really need to start building on this now. So the apprentices and trainees of tomorrow, we need to be considering what that means today. This is probably the most important part of this whole discussion. And this is where collectively as an industry, we need to align. The infrastructure is what is key here. Without the infrastructure, there is no point bringing these vehicles into the country because all they will be is very much trial and bespoke vehicles. In fact, they could just be curiosities. Again, we can't afford to have that in the commercial vehicle industry. And this is why we as a group and through forums such as the ATA, we need to all gather and align and start pushing for this policy to have this infrastructure rolled out. For trucks, as we keep coming back to the fact it's not as simple as a passenger car rollout. We need to think about access. We need to think about turning circles, bridge formulas, axle weights, and so on. There is big change that is coming at us. And the only way that we can keep up with big change is by planning for it and working with governments to get policies in place so that we align and we get the infrastructure that we need. What's most critical with all of this, and this goes to the point about infrastructure, before we can actually have any of these vehicles out on the road, we have this basic multiplication equation. If you look at these four factors here, the electric truck, the charging infrastructure, the incentive, for want of a better word, policy, maintenance and operation. If any one of these items doesn't exist or is zero, the entire equation is zero. Now we'll take care of the truck, as will some of our competitors and everybody else in the market. We are all investing in this technology. Charging infrastructure is something though that we need to work with as a group and as an industry. That is something we are good at making trucks. We're not good at making fuel bowsers or chargers. So that's why partnerships are important and planning is important. Incentive, I don't like the word, I'd rather say policy. In this case though, there is some level of our customers need to have that ability to consider this and make it workable for them. There's absolutely no point in putting in this great zero emission vehicle if when the customer runs it, they lose money or they pass that charge on to their end customer. It simply won't get legs. And this is what, again, our global CEO, Mr. Daum, is very pragmatic about. And even here locally, we take that discussion very seriously. And as we talked about before, maintenance and operation on the road is key for all of this. The vehicles have to keep the wheels turning. Now, finally, just to talk a little bit about hydrogen, this is a really important part of our future. Essentially, a hydrogen vehicle is still an electric vehicle. We're just using hydrogen in a fuel cell to generate electric power to turn electric motors. And this is what we talk about in terms of a combination and complementary technology. To do the long haul task, we do need a transportable high density source of energy. And this is what we get from hydrogen. Specifically for Mercedes-Benz and Daimler Truck and Bus, we are focusing on using liquid hydrogen. Because if you look at these credentials here that we're talking about, 40 tons overall gross combination mass with a payload of around 25 tons, so very much European base. And for the purpose of the discussion, that is an important baseline for us. The next really important thing though is the range. We're talking about moving 25 tons as a 40 ton combination over 1,000 kilometers with only one refuel. Now that's pretty significant when you think about that. And that refueling time is 10 minutes. So now when we start putting these numbers into context, we can see how it relates to the freight task we're talking about today in terms of how much diesel we put into a vehicle and how much we want to drive before we actually need to refuel. Now, this is all done in our particular prototype, and you can see that this is an operating vehicle. This is at our test track in Germany, and it's based on a current generation Actros, as you can see. This is based on 2 liquid hydrogen tanks with a mass of 40 kilograms each. So total 80 kilograms of hydrogen, 10 minutes to refuel. We've moved 25 tons in a 40 ton gross combination mass over 1,000 kilometers. The local CO2 impact of that, 0. So this vehicle is basically putting out water vapor from its exhaust pipe, which is shown in the picture in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. What's really critical here goes back to that renewable discussion. To make this thing completely zero emission and net zero, we need to talk about renewables to make the hydrogen. The credentials here are quite impressive. We're talking about 300 kilowatts of power using a high voltage battery. Now, keep in mind, this battery is going to be of the size and capacity which is markedly smaller than a battery electric vehicle. We will have a peak power output of 400 kilowatts. And those of you that have driven electric vehicles, you can understand how these vehicles will drive. And it's really important to also understand, though, what this means in the context of a truck. We're talking about here in terms of customer trials. Now, this is definitely in Europe, beginning in 2023. So this is trials. They're running around now as prototypes, series production, downline production, second half of the decade. Now, make no mistake, we here in Australia have our hands firmly up for trials on these vehicles, and we do have a very good chance because of the fact that Australia has the potential to have one of the greatest renewable energy networks, because so much of our land and the fact that we're located in the Sunbelt really gives us that ability to support that ambition. So this is a really important point for the future, and I encourage all of you to look at it and keep following this development. So with that, I thank you all for listening to my recorded version of this presentation. As Emily alluded to, please feel free to send me chats and or discussions to follow this up. And I would welcome any type of questions or follow up on this presentation. Thank you again.
Beautiful. Thank you, Romesh. Some really interesting points you raised there, especially when we look at that multiplication equation. You know, it's not just as simple as manufacturing a truck and putting it out there. There's so many other things that come into play, you know, having the right infrastructure in place, and can customers actually afford it, and, you know, not affect their bottom line. So I'm sure there will be some really interesting questions that come your way. As Romesh said, please feel free to post them in the comment box or reach out. And thank you again, Romesh, and interesting to see what questions come about.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.